Good morning, everybody. Great to see you here after the openings reception yesterday. I hope you all feel still fit. Before we start, I have to make a few announcements that probably by now you can have memorized, but the poster exhibits are still on display. Go and have a look at them. Some of them are really good. Take the opportunity to talk to the poster presenters. There are demonstrations in the demo area, and then there are a bunch of extra events. Check out the information about them, see if there are any that are of interest to you. But the one thing I really want to call out is the feedback form. There is on the website, on the homepage of tnc15, there is the feedback button. Please use it. We really use that to improve the program in the coming years. So let us know what you think about the presenters. Let us know if there are topics you want to hear more about in the coming years, and help us improving the program to be even better than it is now. And finally, there are still gala tickets available. So if you don't have one yet, you're still on time. So with that, we are a few minutes late already, so I will keep it very short. We have yesterday we've seen the let's say hardcore networking presentation. Today we are going into the more applied networking field with two very interesting speakers that essentially will show us what you can do with big data and fat pipes, things that we are building and we are not always very much aware of what it's used for, and after this session, I'm sure we all understand again why we are doing this kind of things. First speaker, Manfred Laubichler. He's a professor of theoretical biology and history of biology at Arizona State University. You can read the rest of his bio online, but he is going to share with us some of his fascinating work in detecting patterns in citations and more in general the typical cross-disciplinary use of math, biology, and many other disciplines. So without further ado, Manfred, please take the stage.
Thank you, Klaus, and thanks everybody for waking up that early and sitting here despite sampling of port wine. In light of that, I was taking out all the equations from my presentation, so it will all be digestible. I should say a few words in contextualizing what we do, and it might have something to do with that insane amount of affiliations of mine. We're trying to study innovation, and innovation from genomes all the way to technologies. And since one of my affiliations is the Santa Fe Institute, where I'm a professor, and for those of you who know the Santa Fe Institute, this is a license to be crazy. So this is what follows. The challenge for understanding innovation is that how can we understand innovations in different contexts? First of all, we need to define what an innovation really is. Obviously, all of our politicians and science policy circles want us to be innovative. You cannot turn in a single grant proposal without the word innovative, transformative, and many words like that. Despite all that hype, it is not quite clear what we actually mean by an innovation. So in order to look at this problem, we took a very longue durée perspective. And longue durée perspective means several 100 million years, starting in our case with the emergence of multicellular organisms and the genomes that actually govern and build those organisms. And from there, we moved all the way up to more recent cases of understanding science itself, what is a scientific innovation, or technology. And one of the general features that we discovered here is that innovation has a lot to do with network structures, and network structures at various scales. And one particular form that is very easy to study and also very informative is the role of collaboration in enabling scientific and technological innovation. And that will be a lot of what you will hear in the following minutes. But as an evolutionary and theoretical biologist, let me give you a little bit of context of how to think about innovation. The problem here is that an innovation needs to have a cause and a context. And for those of you who have read Schumpeter and his economical theories that are very relevant here, there's a distinction between invention and innovation. An invention is basically the origin of something new or novel, and innovation are those inventions that actually make it in the marketplace or in the ecology. Now, what that requires us is to integrate two separate perspectives from within evolutionary biology that as of yet have been happily kept separate. One has to do with our understanding of the role of genomes. Genomes are very complex, interactive, integrated regulatory networks that control what goes on in an organism at any given time. They also control how organisms develop from a single fertilized egg to an adult organism. Those are very complex networks. Niches, or ecological niches on the other hand, or ecologies, are those environments, again can be conceptualized as large networks, that determine whether an organism is successful or not. Or if you want, niches are those markets that determine whether an invention is successful and makes a profit for the firm. Now, traditionally, niches have been looked at as external to the organism, or the market has been looked, or the market forces are separate from the innovators somewhere hidden away in IBM's or Cisco's or whatever think tanks. This view has now come under revision in the sense that organisms construct their own niches in many different ways, the same way as companies construct their own markets. So this is what's reflected here with this niche construction perspective. So if you combine those two ideas, you basically have networks all around. You have two sets of highly interactive networks. Now, one consequence of that perspective, and that's sort of the last real bit of theoretical biology you hear, is that out of the combination of those two interactive networks, you can actually derive, in a formal way, a much more adequate conception of history than we have in current evolutionary theory, or also sociology, or even, as I might add, history. So this is what the context for what you're going to hear in the next few minutes is all about. And this is the answer. So this explains everything. No, of course not. This explains the first 30 hours in the life of a sea urchin. This is a gene regulatory network that is very complete and that determines the fate of every single cell that emerges in the first 30 hours in a sea urchin embryo. And it's experimentally verified. What we also could do is we could take this network and turn it into a computational model, and now we can experiment with the computational model. And we can experiment with the computational model in the following way. We can introduce a knockout in the model and determine what would happen, and then do the same knockout in the sea urchin and actually test our model, and the answer is the model works. So we basically understand pretty much everything about the sea urchin in the first 30 hours of its life. But that's a special case, because the environment doesn't really play a role in the first 30 hours of a sea urchin embryo, because the environment has two roles. Either it kills the embryo, that's game over, or it doesn't have any effect on the internal logic of this development. It gets more interesting and also more complicated once you actually have to factor in interactions with the environment. And this is a way to conceptualize those ideas. So traditionally, on the right side, we have defined inheritance in biology as one of passing on genetic information. And then at any given time, those organisms interact with their environment, and the environment determines what we call their fitness value. But in the section below, what you can see here is that we are now looking at this relationship between organisms and environment in a more dynamic way, where we have natural selection as well as niche construction, and as a consequence, we have what's called multiple inheritance systems. Inheritance is not just confined to the genes or the genome. Inheritance can also happen through changes, stable enough changes in the environment. To give you a sort of a human experience example of that, everybody who has young kids or teenagers is very well aware that they have a completely different behavioral repertoire than we used to have growing up, and it's basically inherited because they are glued to all their devices. So the existence of devices, of cell phones, of social media, basically is passed on through time and shapes the phenotype and the behavior of the next generations. Think about it that way. So we have multiple inheritance systems. Okay. If we have those ever so briefly sketched conceptual ideas, what we can then do with those is that we can focus on the interactions between those two dynamics. And the question then becomes, to what extent does the environment or elements of the environment become a resource for our understanding of internal systems, and that is the internalization arrow, and to what extent is the environment actually actively shaped by the actions of those systems, and that's the externalization environment. Those two terms will become relevant later on. Okay, so, and this is the end of the conceptual part. What we are now looking at in evolutionary theory is a representation of evolving processes as acting on complex networks, on graphs, where we have to focus on invention as well as innovation, where we have causal networks operating at multiple levels, including social networks, if you go into science and technology, and where meaning ultimately is rather contextual. Now, we can apply this framework to many different areas, and we actually do in my lab. But for the topic of this conference, let's focus on science and technological innovations and computational approaches of studying that. And we call that computational history of science. Okay, multiple networks. How do you get at this? How do you find innovations in science? So you have here a cartoon version of 3 different layers that are relevant in understanding historical change through time. So you have one level of networks, level 1, that basically codes historical relationships, settings, interactions, basically very deeply connected social networks. So in the case of the scientific literature, this, for instance, are co-authorship networks, co-citation networks, networks of institutional affiliation, of who studied with whom, sort of scientific genealogies and all of that. So those are very big data that you can actually get, at least for recent science, relatively straightforwardly from existing databases. Now this is a social fabric upon which science works, and also within which, in some elements of this social network, innovation happens. Now, On top of this, of course, we have the products of science, the scientific literature, and this is an ever-growing body that, again, is amenable to big data analysis, different set of tools, where we can actually then map the topology of the research literature, again, as it changes through time, and ask the question, how do those changes that we find in the research literature map onto the underlying social networks? So that for those of you familiar with this type of research, you can do topic modeling, semantic analysis of large textual corpora, and so on. So that gives you a dynamic description about how science itself changes. But this is, again, a statistical description. It gives you broad trends. It doesn't help you understand what is really new about a new idea. And in order to get at that level, you have to go up to the third level here, where we actually reconstruct scientific arguments in very close detail. Basically, you turn the argument of a particular scientific theory in a complex graph. And then you compare how those graphs change. And again, you map those changes into, in the scientific representations onto changes in the literature at large and ultimately onto changes in the social networks. So this is how, in principle, we can get at the pattern of innovation within science. Why is this relevant? Well, it has, of course, several implications. It has implications for us if you want to understand the basic understanding of how science works, how scientific theories change. It also has implications for those of us who are in the business of running large scientific institutions such as universities or funding bodies, where everybody wants to enhance the innovative capacities of your institutions. Can we learn anything about the nature of innovation in science in order to, and that's sort of the $64,000 question, in order to enhance our innovation capacity? This is basically the mantra of the European Union. This is the mantra of any of the US science policy settings. This is what we want to do. So this is not just theoretical research, this has practical implications. Now, what I just sketched you very briefly before is that we now can turn this into a big data enterprise, because we can actually begin to study scientific innovations at scale. Not just what we know about how Newton or Galileo or Einstein came about their innovative ideas. So we have very detailed historical case studies of a very small set of science, but rather look at science at large and see what happens throughout the scientific endeavor. Now, in order to do that, we need to combine a lot of basic knowledge about the sciences, about the history of science, with advanced computing, both in terms of the development of algorithms as well as in actually the development of data visualization and data management strategies. So a lot of what you're discussing here at that conference is directly relevant to what we are doing in our research. Okay, so I walk you now through one example, without any math, I promise, that basically is a proof of concept of how you can do this type of research. We look at the history of developmental biology because we know it the best, and so we can actually verify whatever computational analysis tell us. Don't worry about the long history. This is sort of a historical trajectory in the context of evolutionary biology since Darwin. One part of it that is concerned with the origin of variation rather than what happens to variation once it exists in a population. And here we have at the end, in 1969, an important conceptual and theoretical paper by Roy Britton and Eric Davidson that first introduced the concept of a gene regulatory network as an explanatory and theoretical model for understanding how genomes control the development of organisms and subsequently also the evolution of organisms. So it's a very important paper. And what we look at, what happened after that paper. So this is just to show you that this is indeed a very important paper that is also that has a revival over the last 15 years. So you have both first order and second order citations to this paper. You see a peak after it was published, and you see the re-emergence of another peak over the last 15 years. It's even more pronounced if you look at the second order citations. Those are citations to papers that cite the Britton-Davidson paper. And you see that this never really dropped down and that the current peak is really tremendous. So with those type of analysis, you can really ascertain that this paper indeed has set in motion a particular innovative part of science. So this is basically, those are two figures from the paper, so you can recognize the link between those early abstract representations and the concrete representation of the sea urchin network that I showed you before. Okay, again a figure that explains everything. So this is the analysis of about roughly 30,000 papers, full text, where we overlaid two types of reconstruction. Everything in white is basically one of those social networks. It's a citation as a bibliographical coupling network. So two papers are closer to each other when they cite a large number of similar literature. The argument, if they cite the same literature, they are roughly about the same thing. And overlaid with this, what hopefully you can see in the colored dots, are the results of topic modeling of the same papers. Now, topic modeling sorts out texts according to a statistical algorithm that runs over the text and groups them in different topical areas. And there's one important lesson that I want to point out, and I think you might be able to see this. In the main body of this network, everything in white up there are lots of papers in there that are pretty much all about the same thing, and there are very few topics in there. Innovation happens in that area of the graph that is down here from your end in the left corner, where you have connected papers, not as many, but a very dense occurrence of new topics. And if you look into this, what's going on here, what you see is that those are where the idea of a gene regulatory network is translated into different contexts for different explanatory purposes. This is a description in this area, in this domain of science. This is where innovation actually happens. And now we want to know a little more about how it happens. And for that, we looked at something that seems blatantly obvious and that we knew from a lot of case studies, namely that there is a detectable, in principle detectable signature of innovations in networks of co-authorship. Think about it this way. If a new idea gets published, some people will notice that this is a new idea, and they tend to then cooperate because they're united by the recognition of the new idea. And that introduces a slight change into the structure of the collaborative network of science. And the question is, can you find this in big data? And that's what we did with graph analysis of collaboration networks. So just some basic ideas. This is a graph, or those are two representations of a graph. One that you all know, you draw the graph, and the second one is that you basically turn the graph into a matrix. In terms of collaboration networks, the nodes or the vertices are basically authors, and the links are whether they actually collaborate with each other or write a paper with each other, and again, you turn the same thing into a matrix. Now, this is just to give you an example of, first of all, that this is not something new, but secondly, that it is something new. So the history of graphs goes back to the 18th century, where you have the famous 7 bridges of Königsberg problem. And you see graphs for about roughly 250 or so years were an interesting mathematical objects, but they were small, because this is all that we could handle. And over the last 15 or so years, you see an explosion in the size of graphs, largely because of a lot of the work of people in this room. Basically, you build large-scale computational possibilities, and you look at the internet. This is a picture from 1999. I didn't even want to put one up from now. And you look at more and more large-scale graphs, including the kind of citation analysis that we looked for in this work, where we had a network with 300,000 vertices. But you need to develop certain tools to actually deal with this amount of data. The problem, if you want to detect that signature that I showed you in the beginning, that signature of a slight change in the patterns of collaboration, is that you need an algorithm that picks up the signal and separates it from noise. So it's basically a signal detection on complex graphs problem. Again, I'm not going into the math. Basically, what you want to do for graphs is what we are used to do in linear regression analysis, where we draw a line through all those data points, and those that are significantly different, sort of the red ones, are the ones that you are interested in. Now, can we do the same thing on graphs that look like this? Can we find a subgraph within the graph that represents a particular signature? This is the challenge that we need to develop in order to find those patterns of innovations. And the answer is yes, you can do, and I promised you not to talk about all the math in between, so let's just assume a miracle happens. So you look at all those graphs, you apply a certain type of mathematical and computational operation, and you actually find a subgraph that hopefully means something. And then you can pull it out and can really look at it. Okay, what did we find? So one step in this type of analysis has to do that you actually have to reduce the dimensionality of the problem. So you compress something that is represented by 300,000 scientists working in a particular field into, let's say, 2 dimensions. And again, there are reasons and methods how you can do this. And then you get a better picture of what you're dealing with, because this is then a representation of a scientific field at any given point in time. If you look at this for the history of developmental biology, what you can see is how the field changes over a 50-year period. And again, every single dot represents an author in there, so they are just highly compressed because of the dimensionality reduction. And if you can then look into it and figure out what those people were actually doing, what you see here is the emergence first of a paradigm that a single gene is an explanation for a particular problem in developmental biology. And then in the last here is how you move from the single gene to genomes to systems of genes and so on. So it basically gives you an account of the evolution of the field in graph theoretical terms. Now, the problem that we had before was that I told you that we discovered that there's a signature for innovation in the sense that you get a slight realignment of the patterns of collaboration. And in order to get at this, you have to analyze a time series of those graphs, again with some of those methods. And what that does is it allows you to detect elements in the graph that are statistically significantly different. And you can then map them onto a particular person or a particular paper, and that, in a way, is a suspected incidence of an innovation in science through this logic. And so here you have one based on a particular type of filter. And so here there's a lot of work in progress, because you have to design a filter that separates signal from noise. And the way you design the filter requires a lot of knowledge about the way science operates. And it's also different in different fields of science that have different patterns of collaboration. So in turn, the structure of the filter tells you already something about the particular structure of a scientific field. But if you do that, you are able to pick up areas where, let's put it in very neutral terms, something potentially interesting happens. Something that is out of the normal pattern of behavior in science. And you can then look into the network, into the graph, you see who are the people, what's going on there, and you can actually use this with very large data sets, develop an idea of where are suspected regions of innovation in a particular scientific field. Okay, we can do that. That's nice. For those of you who are interested in the details, email me. I can send you all the papers that we have on that. Now, let's put this back into a different context. Let's put it back into the fact that science is an activity of people interacting in a social setting. And so what we then did, we combined this type of big data analysis that gives you regions of suspected innovation with an agent-based model where we made certain measurable assumptions about what motivates an individual scientist. And since we focus on collaboration, we basically created two parameters that determine with whom and how often a scientist is likely to collaborate. Basically, think about it this way. You can either collaborate with somebody who is more or less exactly like you, and then you have a lot of shared interests, or you collaborate with somebody who is very different and has a different type of expertise than you, and you can turn this into a parameter, and you can measure it, for instance, by taking the publications of the scientists before they started to collaborate, line them up, perform a semantic analysis, and turn it into a parameter. The same is, what is the field of interest of those scientists? And for that, you can use as a proxy, what journals are they reading and citing? And again, you create an overlap between people who read exactly the same literature or people who read rather different literatures. Now, what you can then do, you turn it into an agent-based model with certain assumptions, X number of people in the network, in the group, having a certain behavioral model with whom they collaborate, having a certain distribution of those types in the population, and let's assume they write 4 papers a year and something like that, and you create an artificially created collaborative network that you can compare to real ones that you find from the literature. So if you do that, you create those model-generated networks based on different assumptions. So here you see one that this is completely, so there's only small cliques. Here's one that looks relatively interesting because it has certain concentrations and a rather high connectivity. I can't remember what this one, it's just a very curious shape. And one that you also find where the majority of work is highly clustered and you have a few outliers throughout the network. Anyway, so you can create any number of artificial networks. If you then want to turn that into or feed that or compare it with real-world scenarios, then you actually have to measure those parameters. We did it here. This is just one important scientist in the field of evolutionary medicine, where you look at his types of collaboration. Those are the real and existing ones that you can observe in the literature. And then we also measured the parameters of David Haig and his collaborators, ran our model, and here you see what the model generates and what reality looks like. So basically, not giving you the sort of the fit between the two, but it is a pretty good fit. So it shows that with our agent-based model and the parameters that we put in there, the ones that you can actually also measure, you can indeed, in a meaningful way, recreate the actual behavior that you see in networks of collaboration. Okay, so what do those two things have in common? Of course, the really interesting question now is, and this is where we are currently engaged in, is if you take approach number one, that allows you to find suspected areas of innovation in those large graphs. And then you take approach number 2, where we actually have a model that is also verified about how specific behavioral types of scientists shape the structure of collaborations, and you can classify them by their, let's say, collaborative profile. The obvious question is, who are the people who are involved in those innovative regions in science that we find in the large data analysis? Who generates innovations in science? This is sort of the question here. We have some good preliminary insights into that. Not enough that I would stand up here and tell you this is exactly who are the innovators. But what I want to point out here is that this type of approach has a lot of implications for how you design networks of collaborations. What kind of collaboration strategy should you, as a funding body, as a university president, as somebody like me who is in charge of research initiatives at a university, what should we pursue? And there are a few interesting lessons here, which I didn't put on a slide because I don't want to be, responsible for saying things that could come back to me, but I'm happy to tell you. So for those of you who are in academic departments, one lesson: don't let your department determine the hiring plan of new faculty, because they have a tendency to find somebody very close to themselves, or they want to replace somebody they lost. This is a strategy that does not lead to innovation. So in other words, define a problem and then hire the people, and you get different expertise, different interests, and somehow find a mechanism to incentivize or force them to collaborate. This, in most of the cases where we looked at, are the kind of constellations that lead to innovation. On the other hand, I don't know whether we have representatives from ERC and other funding bodies here. Do not let review panels be determined by disciplinary scientists. This is another recipe for disaster. It's safe because it generates predictable outcomes, but it doesn't generate innovation. So if you actually want to focus on innovation, do not let those conservative forces run the show, so to speak. Of course, the more money that is at stake, the more conservative those panels are. Speaking from the US perspective, the absolute, now you know why I didn't put this on a slide, the absolute worst panel is the National Institute for Health. They only did hand out about $35 billion a year, most of it pretty much wasted. But because it has this intrinsic social dynamic that generates predictable and safe science, but is not really conducive for generating innovation. Do I have answers how to do it differently? No, not. Well, I might have some ideas, but I don't have any answers. But the type of research that we actually are engaged in here to really document it much more than we already have, now that we sort of know how to do it, is in a way necessary to give us an assessment about how science at large works and how innovation in science at large works. Because we have been seduced by an idea that comes from sort of the traditional approach to the history of science as sort of an inspiration for current science, where we focused in on a small number of highly successful people and wrote their biographies and studied them and studied them and studied them again. How many books have been written about Darwin, about Newton, about Galileo, and so on. And we don't really know what goes on in the rest of science. And in a way, there was a reason for this, because until we have the type of computational tools and data that are needed to do this kind of work, there was no way of getting at those information. Now we can, and now that we actually can study scientific innovation at scale in large networks, we can ask those different questions and can actually determine where in the nature of science do we actually find innovations, and can we generalize from those insights. Okay, so we talked about that. Okay, now going back to away from the soapbox and preaching about what's wrong with science policy to some concrete scientific insights here. What we have shown, and what I'm confident to put on a slide, is that graphs and large-scale networks are really an effective way of studying the necessary interactions that we need to understand if we want to understand innovation at scale, whether we are talking about genomes and sea urchins, or whether we are talking about science and technology. There is one caveat in there, and that is that in order to do that, we still have to build a lot about the computational, statistical, and graph theoretical tools that would make an effective study. So that means if you have any students that are talented and are looking for a topic, tell them they should all become graph theorists or network theorists, because this is pretty much what a new math is. Some of the things that we showed actually do work. So there is a way that you can build a statistical signal processing approach that allows you to find, let's say, potentially interesting and significant subgraphs that you are interested in. And we have already also showed that this does work in the context of the history of science vis-a-vis the study of the emergence of innovation. Now, if you then want to go one further step in terms of now general theory behind that, one fascinating aspect of this is that once you look at networks, whether it's now networks of scientists, conceptual networks, or networks of genes in a genome, what we do find is we find isomorphic principles. Oh, at least now everybody is awake, which is good, because the next talk has a lot of interesting and cool pictures. So what we do find is we find isomorphic structures in those networks across different domains. What that means is open for discussion. Does this mean that we actually, with the study of complex systems and networks, we are moving towards a more generalized science of complexity that applies in a variety of domains? I would suspect so, but it's too early to tell, because we have to learn a lot more about those isomorphic properties. But what they do allow is that you can actually move concepts across domains. So you can talk in a meaningful way about innovation, whether it's within a genome, or whether it's within science, or whether it's within technologies. Now, of course, what I am here to tell you requires a lot of people, requires a lot of networks, and so here you see a network of collaborators, of grad students and postdocs, and of course also a network of funding bodies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manfred. I want to allow for one or two, depending on how long you make your questions. So are there any questions in the audience?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Can you tell me if your research is funded by NIH or NSF, and if so, what they think of it?
It's funded by NSF in part. They are actually interested in it. We haven't shown them the data that proves that they are very ineffective in stimulating innovation, because we don't have, they can always find out, point to this, this, and this. But in general, they are interested because in an area of limited resources, they have intense discussions about how to best use their resources. And at NSF, there is an ongoing debate between sort of a move towards funding bigger and bigger entities of interdisciplinary collaboration, and then not knowing how to evaluate the proposals, or sort of the traditional individual researcher-funded model. I think similar discussions are happening in the European Union. But in terms of funding, I have to say that I have an easier time going to foundations and convincing them of that kind of project. So, for instance, the Volkswagen Foundation just funded us with $1.5 million for a project like this, because they are more flexible in using their money to say, okay, this is interesting, this is what we want to do. So, yes, you see the problem.
Thank you. I think we'll defer any further questions to the coffee break. Manfred, once again, thanks for a very interesting talk. Next up is Sarah Kenderdine, professor at the University of New South Wales in Australia, and like Manfred, a bunch of other affiliations that I will not go into here. And Sarah is going to show us some of the work she's been doing on the crossroads of new media and cultural heritage, and all the kind of wonderful immersive experiences you can create with that. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you. Bom dia and obrigado, Klaus. It's a great pleasure to be invited to this forum to throw a light on the potential for big data networking in the humanities, specifically in museums. To give this presentation in such a historically important and culturally intact heritage city resonates strongly with what I'm going to show you today. I'd like to acknowledge in particular Jean-Guy Hovarth and the teams at GIANT, FCCN, NordUnet and PCO for their stupendous organization, alongside the sponsors that are enabling this event. I'd also like to thank ARNet Australia for their recognition and support of our research. In the world of museums where I come from, traditional boundaries have been thrown wide open. The digital is expanding our collecting policies, renewing our curatorial visions, and refreshing our relationships with audiences through their participation. And my talk will focus on a series of experimental immersive interfaces for museums that transform cultural heritage data, allowing audiences to rediscover and reinvent ancient cities, cultural landscapes and practices, and museological collections. As the CEO of Intel, Brian Krasnick, said last year, we're in the midst of a transformation from a world of screens and devices to a world of immersive experiences. The research that we're doing on the reformulation of cultural heritage data is supported by a range of organizations, the iCinema Research Centre at UNSW in Sydney, the Applied Laboratory for Interactive Visualization Embodiment, ALIVE, at the Science Park in Hong Kong, where I'm Director of Research, the ZKM Institute for Visual Media in Karlsruhe, Germany, and Museum Victoria in Melbourne, where I also work. Collectively, we've designed and built about 12 large-scale immersive systems, and this is over the last 15 years or so, and they offer us strategies for multi-sensory engagement and give us powerful ways to reformulate narrative in a digital context, They emphasize human-to-human as well as human-to-machine interaction. And the larger of these systems accommodates about 40 people at any one time. Digital imaging technologies have become vital tools for us to be able to create futures from the past. While politically motivated destruction of heritage has been with us for thousands of years, climate change catastrophes are increasing at alarming rates. Natural disasters wreak havoc, and mass tourism is engulfing those places that we hold most dear. As this, I guess, networking conference partly celebrates, and many of the activities in archaeology, 3D technologies are allowing us to create exceptionally high resolution pictures of the world. Laser scanning, for example, collects billions of points to represent places, such as these heads at Mount Rushmore, scanned by the Scottish 10. We can create precious objects in 3D and peer inside to see what was previously unseen. And we can also capture art in a way that allows us to zoom in to the tiniest brushstroke and reveal more than the naked eye can see. But these new imaging technologies alone are not enough to bring these cultural objects and places to life in ways that are profound and unforgettable for general public. And it's about creating these narratives of engagement that's at the heart of the research that we undertake. Inhabiting cultural landscapes. So we'll begin our journey today in the Dongguan Caves of the Gobi Desert in northernmost China. It's at the nexus of the Silk Road. It's a World Heritage Site, 492 caves dug into this cliff. Inside are 45,000 square meters of painted frescoes and over 2,500 stucco statues. And it was crafted by Buddhist monks over a period of 1,000 years. It's a sublime art treasury that has no comparison in the Chinese Buddhist world. It's under the jurisdiction of the Dongguan Academy, and they employ over 600 full-time workers. Inside some of these caves were extraordinary documents. The oldest book in the world, the Diamond Sutra, was found in the so-called library cave. And at the bottom, the earliest known depiction of the Chinese constellations. These were all removed from the site by European explorer archaeologists. They're now distributed across 18 countries. They're digitized and, I guess, digitally repatriated under the International Dongguan Project, which is running out of the British Library. The caves are under serious threat from tourism, so there's only 10 caves out of 492 that are open to public. There are 60 full-time photographers working there. They camera array photograph every one of these caves, and they also laser scan. It takes about 3 months to digitize a single cave, and they stitch the data in situ. So we took the texture data for cave 220 and its laser scan and created a model. And to create pure land inside the Magao grottos at Dongguan, it's staged in a 360-degree 3D interactive environment, and it's 10 meters across and 4.5 meters high, and it allows about 40 people a one-to-one scale experience of being inside this cave. So it starts with a very simple cave browser, significant caves at Dongguan, laid over a laser scan of the entire escarpment. You go inside cave 220 and we simulate what it's like to be there now, where a guide and 60 other people use a single LED torch to reveal the mural paintings. But because it's a digital cave, we can light it up, navigate it. We created a high-resolution magnifying glass, so that's about 4K in there, for examining the murals in great detail. This is a Sutra of the Medicine Buddhas on the north wall of the cave. We did recoloring of the mural paintings based on the pigment studies of the archaeologists at Dongguan. These were hand-painted by the Dongguan Academy and integrated. We modeled many of the elements in the painting in 3D, so there are 32 musicians. Their instruments were modeled. And we filmed Beijing Academy dancers in a blue screen studio and inserted their video into the virtual world to represent the 4 dancers in the painting. So essentially it was a strategy for, I guess, a prototype for what you could do with 492 caves and different strategies of visualization. What's actually happened is that now this work has been seen by about 650,000 people, and there are multiple installations around the world going on. When it was at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, Philip Kennicott, Washington Post critic, said, "At last we have a virtual reality system worthy of inclusion in a museum devoted to the real stuff of art." And this is on the museum floor, is where the major tension is now being played out between the real and the virtual. They sort of have their websites, and they can cope with that, putting their data online. But actually inside the galleries is where we see this major tussle happening. And as we begin to create ultra-high fidelity works, we're in a situation where we're creating experiences of aura that, in a way, they don't compete, but they augment the real. We have a new $2 million grant, collaborative learning through immersion, so 2 million euros, which is starting soon, and it's going to connect 2 of our AV systems, one in Sydney and one in Hong Kong, for mixed reality teaching and learning, where classes from both countries come together for intercultural sessions, and multidisciplinary subjects will be taught. There'll be tablet-based video conferencing inside this large-scale VR experience. Art history, new media design, architecture, conservation, fashion, global history, and business will all be taught in this connection. So we took the wireframe from the laser scan of this data set and printed it on the walls of an exhibition booth, again at 1:1 scale. And visitors are now walking inside the model at 1:1 scale, examining the murals in high resolution on their tablets. It's like a window on the world. You can see the ceiling, which you cannot see in the AV system easily. It's 3 qualities: highly social, single user, multi-spectator scenarios are extremely important in museums, and this is what they engender, this is what they harness, is a highly social activity. It's also multi-generational, from young kids to middle-aged ladies. Grandmother, grandchild. Grandmother abandons the grandchild. And it has one other phenomenon, which is this, and it's sort of a virtual tourism, because this is the wife. She takes her iPad out of her handbag and she's filming her husband's experience at the sort of a double entendre. We have a permanent installation of this work now in China. It's staged on a 220-degree screen, which is about 9 meters wide and 5 meters high. And in this, any member of the public may drive their own experience. So there's just a simple iPad interface, and you can move through all the steps in a sort of quasi-real-time fashion. And it was obligatory to do a head-mounted display version of this work. In this case, the computer's in a backpack, and the user is being tracked. So there are actually 2 tracking. There's a connect and a leap motion. You can put your body into the world, and you are walking around, again at 1:1 scale. So this is just an installation at a Autodesk conference in San Francisco recently. You're looking at the point of view of the user. They've got noise-cancelling headphones on. Those are her kids, actually. As she walks around, if she gets too close to the edge of the model, it will go all blurry and she will back off. Because you are kinesthetically moving around. There's also a door which looks real world scale. There's no motion sickness whatsoever, which is very common with head-mounted display. And the Leap Motion provides the user with scale, a relative scale. Those kids are looking at the same point of view as you are. So it's like 101 things to do with one data set, because we're now doing a full dome show for the World Economic Forum of this same work. So moving from ancient China to historic India, Place Hampi is an artwork that was commissioned originally in 2006, subsequently toured the world. Hampi is both a monumental World Heritage Site and a vibrant center for contemporary pilgrimage, and the artwork recombines 25 square kilometers of this extraordinary terrain in a 3D panoramic imaginary. It's shot on quite a rare camera. There are only 4 of these in the world. It has 2 stereo film, 220 film on the top, a computer at the bottom which rotates it in 360 degrees. It's a slit camera. And from that we can create panoramic worlds that people can navigate. We use ambisonic sound recording for all of the sound spaces for each one of the panoramic images, motion capture for animation. So it's staged in again a 360-degree screen, but it has a motorized platform in the middle of it, and you're rotating a field of view in 360 degrees. It's passive stereo here. We have an active stereo version also. Any member of the public gets up and they take themselves and the visitors that are in the space, about 25 can be there, on a serendipitous journey of discovery of the many wonderful locations at Hampi. You can speak into a microphone which is mounted on the platform, release Sanskrit's text into the world, coming from chapter 13 and 37 of the Ramayana, because Hampi is said to be Kishkinda from the Ramayana. It's augmented with computer graphics done by Indian artists and animators. It was the first 3D animation ever done in India. We trained this animation house in stereographics. Music by Dr. L. Subramaniam, who's a Carnatic violin superstar. Again, more or less at one-to-one scale. So this is now permanently located next to the real site in India, in a new cultural precinct called Kaladam, where we built the entire museum with a series of rooms. And we're now, because of the success of that project, embarking on Place Karnataka, which will use multiple sites throughout India and, or rather the state of Karnataka, and image them in a variety of very high resolution ways: laser scanning, drone photography, stereographic panoramas, panoramic video, lots of intangible and tangible heritage. Also in India, this is the Prince of Wales Museum in Mumbai, and we're creating a new artwork which will be installed in December. For this we shot 160 gigapixel panoramas. This is India Gate. This is the fisheye perspective from the panorama, so it's about 10,000 pixels wide. The new Terminal 3, the Baujilad Museum, and these will be projected up into the dome of the building. It's about a 60-foot dome. There's an algorithm that actually runs this installation, so this is just a video of what it's going to look like. And 3 floors below, there'll be a mirror, so it will act like a tunnel in time and space. You can rediscover the city with fresh eyes. We also have in Australia now just about to take receipt of a $600,000 4K full dome. So this has got 15 partners throughout Australia, 11 organizations. ARNet is one of these partners. Creating a number of works for this system. This is the animatic done for the National Museum of Australia. It's a 12-meter dome with a mirror on the floor. It will eventually be a 6-meter dome with a mirror on the floor. And it maps the constellations, dynamic pathways throughout the desert, and also clan relationships. And the visitors are suspended between these two hemispherical images. Lots of satellite photos and also artwork done by the Matu sisters and ladies who paint that particular songline in the in indigenous tradition. Mirrors have their problems. Things are upside down sometimes, so that's one of the creation issues, design issues for this work. And with ARNet, thanks. We're going to connect the 4K planetarium in Melbourne with the Dome Lab in Sydney, which is also 4K, with our cupola in Hong Kong, so that's a 2K system. And while this could be conceived of as an exercise in networking, it opens up for us as, I guess, designers of experience, the underlying potential of this high bandwidth networking and giving us tools with which to implement. Moving from landscapes to objects, this is the museum I work for in Melbourne, 1,000 stuffed animals, 5 what we call panoramic navigators, and these are used to locate objects in space, and you can, when you rotate your screen, you're able to select the creature that you want to have a look at. It gives you 3D models and also movies of these particular creatures in the wild. You can download it to your phone, things like that. And this is a section of the 18-meter scroll painting, Pacifying of the South China Sea Pirates, which is an icon item from the Hong Kong Maritime Museum in Sydney, in Hong Kong. And it's really based around the South China Sea and the subjugation of the pirates. We scanned this image at 1,200 dpi. It's in 18 meters at 55 centimeters high. This allows you to see more than you can see actually with your naked eye. The museum bought a 360 3D system, and it's demountable and staged here. We created 55 animated events which play out over the scroll's surface as it rotates. These animations are very 2D in style. It's pretty bloody, gory sort of scroll painting. And interactive sea mists open and close as the scroll is rotating. So you're unfolding the scroll much in the way that it would have been read initially, but once it's enlarged, such as that enlargement animation there, it's about 450 meters long, so in terms of data. We're also working a lot in the 4 and soon 8K screen world. This is a 4K screen, same data set. It's mounted on top of a light box. The real scroll is right behind you. And using a tablet, visitors are able to navigate inside this high-resolution data, and it's augmented with 197 texts coming from 2 historic documents that describe what's going on and some of the important characters in the scene. It's an LED array at the bottom which shows you where you are at any time. There's a bit of video here. Yeah, it's quite simple. It's in 2 languages. Most of the work we're doing is in 2 or 3 languages, or there are options for 2 or 3 languages. We undertake a lot of high-resolution scanning because there is, in fact, a real deficit of big data out there in the humanities. We're creating a lot of software for 4 and 8K zooming, which is not particularly innovative in that it's just tiling, but to do it seamlessly and to do it with cultural material allows you to go from an image like this, which is about 30 gigabytes, to that in a very seamless way. And you can augment it with sound or text. We recently scanned this image, which is I'll just go back. It's an etching done by Henry Barker for Robert Barker's Panorama in Leicester Square. So it's a very historic document drawn from Galata Tower in 1853. And we're creating this augmented reality viewer that allows you to overlay a contemporary gigapixel image onto the historic world. You can increase and decrease the transparency. The text labels actually will be printed in the historic style on the floor in a big circle. You could do this actually with Porto. You can't do it with that many cities. You have to have a close correlation between the extant city and its contemporary manifestation, the historic and the contemporary. So we also work with databases and databases full of cultural materials. So this is one we actually created ourselves. It's 24 hours of free-to-air broadcast television footage from Australian TV, 5 channels. It was analysed by software. Every time there was a camera angle change, a cut was made in the movie. And we ended up with a database of about 25,000 clips. So we hired 4 guys, put them in a room to hand tag each one of these 4-second clips. And we're using very idiosyncratic metadata. We're looking at emotion, expression, physicality, scene, speed and scene structure, and more obvious tags like gender, color, things like that. So we can now stream 500 simultaneous streams of video, and you can then operate on this database. So you can click on any image.
Over there, if you will. His deadlines, more discerns and more discerns and more discerns.
And it goes into the database and it brings everything that's most semantically similar to one side and everything that's most dissimilar is behind you. It's got a range of interfaces. Actually, a wand is used. It's really noisy because it's TV data. You can bring up a way in which you can weight your search. So this allows you to make search preferences. So he will click on this fiery red image. It's a very easy example to show you what's going on. And all the fiery red stuff is on one side and all the black and white stuff is behind you. It's actually based on luminosity, not on color, but that's another issue. You can click on any image and it will play the entire video through. So in a loop, all the other videos freeze. And you can add clips together. So we call this recombinatory narrative or recombining the narrative. So then you can create your own movie in a kind of mash-up culture.
Always wondered if there was somebody on the other side. First week. Always wondered if there was somebody on the other side of the universe.
At most museums, only a fraction of the collection is on display. So this is a Smithsonian, 2% on display. British Museum, it's 0.4%. And at Museum Victoria Melbourne, it's 0.8. So we've just created them a data browser. It's an export from the content management system. So it's 100,000 objects, took 15 minutes to get the data. And we connect 18 thematic subsections of this data together using the metadata that's already inherent. We use about 25 fields of the 280 fields in the database itself. You can zoom into any of the images that you choose. If there are more than one image associated with that object, you'll see them too. Creates a Wordle from the content management system, and it allows you to access the original record. And then you'll see some fairly raw-looking tags, and those lines lead you to other thematic collections across the whole data set. So the museum owns a 360 3D system. It's a permanent installation, and this is where this work belongs. We're also bringing the online inside. So this is Wikipedia data. This is harvested, okay? So it's canned on the system. Bernd Lintemann, ZKM, coded this. It's a 360 system, and it allows you a kind of visual browsing metaphor. You access the image, then you access the record after that. And eCloud for World War I, so this is a work for Europeana, the world's largest cultural portal. They've got about 27 million objects online. Is this me that's making that noise? So the screen is 9 meters wide, 3.5 meters high. It's a stereo screen. We harvested their World War I data, so they're running road shows in Europe, driving around, collecting people's material. They digitize and ingest it and upload it. Within the first 6 weeks, they had 70,000 objects online. It's great material. And it's filled with propaganda, great artworks drawn in the trenches, prosthetic devices. So all of these imply, of course, something else about the war. I might get a new pack. I'll keep going. I'll show you the movie. Sure. I can use this microphone, actually. So this is a Bible. The guy was lying with the Bible on his chest, and a bullet went into the Bible, and he was saved. So the Europeana realized that they have some extraordinary material. They selected and curated 18 stories to start this application. It's staged on this screen, and just using a tablet interface, you can select any one of the images. It launches its associated images, and the metadata tags are generated, and then you're in clouds, basically, of metadata. So you're able to traverse the data set. It brings all sides of the war together, so that's also quite an interesting, I guess, juxtaposition. Human tragedy is common. This is the first installation we did. It was rear projected, but now it's front projected, so it's quite slightly different. And as you can see here, if you click on the metadata tag again, it will refresh the cloud. So what's important about that work, before I go on to the next section, is really the ability to do it in real time and to take data that exists on the internet and reformulate it in these frameworks in real time. And that's a project that I will be starting in Australia later this year, to be able to do that for a state library. Intangible heritage is one of the more complex of the data sets that we need to be able to capture. This is a simple work, actually, done with Saburo Tashigarawa, who's a Japanese choreographer. He was filmed at 1:1 scale, one of his principal dancers as well, from 6 points of view, and then it's projected into the reactor system, which is a rear projected stereo system, and it allows visitors to walk around the outside and look in at 1:1 scale. Because it's shot in stereo, the limbs come in and out of the screen because of the positive and negative parallax. And there's a small installation video there. Kung Fu is a big project that we're undertaking in Hong Kong. This is our Kickstarter video. It turned out to be the world's most expensive data cleanup job. So we're capturing all the senior members of all the South Chinese lineages inside the mocap studio. Hong Kong is a great repository for this kind of intangible heritage once they left China.
As Hong Kong has been a relatively
This is the
stable
co-director,
society and
Hing
did not
Chao.
experience the political and social interruptions that mainland China has experienced in the course of the 20th century, particularly the Cultural Revolution. The continuation of traditional Chinese martial arts practice is better in Hong Kong than in mainland China.
So we've just started to annotate, so we're doing motion over time studies, but in real time. So what you see at the bottom there is the left hand, the right hand, the left foot, the right foot, and the dantian point, the middle of the body. And it's part of a whole series of work that we're doing in motion over time studies, also Confucian rights projects. Wang Dongling is a famous Chinese action calligrapher. He painted a 30-meter building banner for our building, and you can see a GoPro attached to the brush. And we've just produced this for him, which allows him to write every single character in the Chinese alphabet, and we'll create an app that allows people in China to send their text messages in the calligraphy of a famous Chinese calligrapher. So hopefully we'll all get fabulously rich. That's the uncleaned up data, and that's the cleaned up data on that side. I'm going to skip the evaluating experience, although there's a whole section there. And I'm going to go to where we are now today. Atlas of Maritime Buddhism is a new project we're undertaking. It's dealing with the whole expansion of trade and religion from South India. We're really dealing with the right-hand side of the map up into China and Korea and Japan, South China Sea. This coincides, of course, with a massive expansion by the Chinese government currently to recreate the overland Silk Road and the maritime Silk Route. It's based on a whole range of heterogeneous archaeological materials. We have about 30 sites located. We've got researchers in 30 places working to aggregate data. We'll put these sites on a map, and visitors can navigate the map, find what it is that they want to go into or want to explore. We'll shoot stereographic panoramas at all of these locations, and you can navigate in different ways, and will then augment. If you enter inside a panorama, it will be augmented with this very heterogeneous archaeological data. So it's a way of integrating these very disparate types of navigational experiences. That's the research challenge. It will premiere in China, also Sydney and Hong Kong. And this is our new project. It's really in a large-scale visualization, primarily for medical data, so not cultural data, allowing scientists to see with fresh eyes, building on our whole tradition of large-scale immersive systems. So it will also reframe how research is perceived, because there's a heavy emphasis here on engagement science. You'll be familiar with the Cave 2 Illinois development. There's a whole range of medical viz systems out there, big scale ones, the Allosphere, etc. And we're going to take over a building on campus. We're going to have a new effectively Cave 3, or it won't be called that. And we will also put the full dome in there. So the Cave will be a rear projected video system. It'll be equivalent or higher to the Cave 2. And it also overcomes some of the challenges to do with bezels and also cross-reflection, and also the problems with stereo that the other cave does. And there are 10 projects that are going to take place in the system in the next 5 years, including things like operating theatre of the future, a range of big data informatics, bioinformatics, and omic data visualization. It's really the equivalent of unlimited screen real estate. And with the dome, it turns out the dome is quite good for brain imaging and visualization because of its architectonic space. And so when we combine some of these connectome data sets through data fusion with volumetric data, we're hopefully going to have some interesting outcomes. And this is a 4K video work by the medical animator Drew Berry, which will premiere in Sydney in August in the Dome Lab. So we're working across a whole range of paradigms, I guess. This is the common cold rhinovirus, magnified 1 billion times. And just to finish, back to cultural heritage, Illuminating Asia is a new world touring show. It will premiere in Australia next year, and it takes all of our 10 systems, puts them all together in one space, and allows visitors to engage with over 20 pieces of content, so it's tangible and intangible heritage. And that's the end of my talk, and this video can just run because it will repeat some of the things we've already looked at, and there's a whole lot more. This is the wayfinding device in the middle. Audio is on a lapel with very directional speakers. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Pleasure.
It is time for the coffee break, but nevertheless, I'm going to allow for back there is a question.
Great talk. Fabulous stuff. Thank you. I'm curious how much computing needs to be co-located with one of these to do the data processing?
There's lots of computing, yeah.
But 500 cores, 50,000 cores. I mean, what's the scale of the computing installation?
So typically the AV system, as opposed to the new system we're about to build, which will be much bigger. I think it needs about 32 IGs with it. This one is, AV is, it depends on the configuration, but it's about 8 computers at any one time. I don't speak in cores, so...
that gives me a scale. Thank you very much.
So yeah, it's a range.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
More questions? I actually was wondering, when you were talking about the less than 1% of a collection that a museum typically shows, you were explaining how you can make the rest of the collection available as well. And when you were talking about that, I was thinking the whole concept of a museum doesn't make a lot of sense anymore then, because is there any reason why I would not look at the Smithsonian collection when I'm in Melbourne?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's certainly something about being there that's really important, and juxtaposition with real objects and the creation of special experiences. Otherwise, we'd never leave home. We'd just look at it on the internet or soon on our head-mounted display. Yeah. So the thing that I'm really interested in is how you can harness the social space on the way towards ubiquitous computing. And bring together, and museums, their responsibility really now is to provide exceptional other experiences, not iPhone apps and audio guides, because these are not that interesting. And juxtaposing the real with the virtual, I think, is the most powerful thing to be doing. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. There's one question back there.
It was, first, congratulations again. And I was going to say something similar to class. I understand what you're saying. The experience is much better in the museum. You're working for a museum trying to enhance the experience. but then second best is better than nothing. And there are so many opportunities for people unable to visit all those wonderful places. In terms of time, even in a lifetime, we wouldn't visit all the places we would like to see. So I think that open policy and having even limited app access to this very useful and wonderful information is better than nothing, I guess. So.
Oh, no, absolutely. I do agree. Yeah. No, distribution is great.
So the very last question from, I'm not going to say fellow Australian because I learned that she's from New Zealand, but go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, once again, wonderful presentation. Thank you, Sarah. In a world beset with governments that are talking austerity and looking at the costs of a lot of digitization,
yeah.
What is the future for this, and where are you going to get your funding?
So, I mean, surprisingly, a lot of our works are extremely modest in cost. So the Dongguan show, seen by 650,000 people, costs $50,000. The Europeana work costs 12,000 euros. So these are not big costs. Fieldwork is probably the most expensive thing, and then data processing. Once you have a machine, you can put multiple works in a single machine. So that's bang for your buck. Absolutely. The biggest challenge to the cultural sector right now is data curation. It's lost data, it's not well tagged data, it's not migrated data, it's all of those problems. With our works, we also get this question, well, how can you preserve your work? But we don't even try to do that. What we do is a lot of documentation. We have all the raw data, and we're able to recreate the work using the best available at that time, which constantly improves. There are diminishing costs, actually, for most of this stuff. So not only does the tech get better, it gets cheaper. And it's extremely, in a way, if you can take people to sites that they can't see otherwise, it has a very powerful social outcome to do with the mindset of society, hopefully.
Okay.
Sort of your question.
We really have to stop now, otherwise you guys will not have coffee. I want to thank you all for coming. I'm pretty sure you all think it's worthwhile getting out of your bed to attend both of these talks. I want to ask for one more round of applause for both speakers for a fascinating session. Thank you.
They could have been showing this. They could have been showing that during but they're not. They turned it off.
I have to admit, I was looking at that screen a lot because it's so much more colorful than up there.
Yeah, no, they're